Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the greatest threat to American food security isn't a foreign adversary, a changing climate, or a global shipping crisis, but a policy decision made in Washington regarding a pink rock mined deep beneath the soil of Saskatchewan? And what if I told you that the narrative of toughness you see on the evening news is actually masking a profound economic vulnerability that has just handed Canada, specifically Saskatchewan, one of the most powerful geopolitical levers in the 21st century? These are not hypothetical questions. We are witnessing a collision between political rhetoric and geological reality, a clash that is reshaping the North American relationship in ways that few are discussing openly. Today, we are going to look past the headlines and the bluster. We are going to dissect the facts, the data, and the long-term implications of the United States' recent threat to impose very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer. We will explore how a $1 trillion trade surplus in China connects to a soybean farmer in Iowa, and why a combine manufacturer moving to Germany signals a fundamental shift in the global order. We often hear that in the game of global trade, the United States holds all the cards. We are told that their market size guarantees dominance and that their neighbors exist primarily to serve that market. But the events of the last few months have revealed a crack in that armor. By threatening Saskatchewan's potash industry, the U.S. administration hasn't demonstrated strength. They have exposed a jugular vein of their own agricultural economy. To understand the gravity of this situation, we must first examine the catalyst for this crisis. The United States administration has explicitly threatened to impose very severe tariffs on potash imports from Canada. The logic, as stated live on television by the president, is to bolster domestic production. The argument presented was that because potash comes from Canada, the United States should tax it to force domestic production. We can do it here. We can all do that here, was the claim. But there's a fundamental flaw in this thinking, one that exposes a deep misunderstanding of basic geology. Potash is not a factory-made widget. It is not a flat-screen television or a piece of software that can be coded in Silicon Valley if the price is right. Potash is potassium. It is a biological necessity for plant growth. It is the lifeblood of modern agriculture. Without it, crop yields collapse and food production falters. Here is the hard, cold fact that no amount of political will can change. The United States does not have the geology to be self-sufficient. According to economic analysis of the U.S. agricultural sector, American farmers rely on Canadian supply for nearly 90% of their potash. Let that number sink in. 90%. This is not a diversified supply chain where a buyer can simply switch vendors if they don't like the price. This is a state of near total dependency. Canada, and specifically the province of Saskatchewan, controls the largest high-quality potash deposits in the world. It is, effectively, the Saudi Arabia of fertilizer. The United States simply does not have the geological capacity to replace this supply. As we have heard from experts, you cannot legislate a mineral deposit into existence. Geology does not care about tweets, campaign promises, or executive orders. When the U.S. administration threatened to tax this import, they were not holding a gun to the head of the Canadian economy. They were pointing it directly at the American farmer. The markets understood this immediately. The moment the threat was uttered, before a single law was signed, before a single tariff was collected, the price of potash surged. The markets priced in the disaster instantly. This reaction illustrates a concept known as inelastic demand. If the price of a vacation goes up, you can choose to stay home. If the price of a new car rises, you can keep your old one for another year. But if you are a farmer in Iowa or Nebraska and the price of fertilizer doubles, you cannot choose to stop fertilizing your crops unless you want to go bankrupt. You have to pay it. The U.S. administration, in trying to punish Canada, effectively handed a loaded weapon to market speculators. These trading houses and speculators thrive on volatility. Stability is bad for speculation because if prices are predictable, it is hard to make a quick fortune. But when a government throws a hand grenade into a critical supply chain, the markets go wild. The traders make millions riding the wave of panic, while the real economy, the farmers and the rural communities, suffers. The uncertainty premium was passed instantly to the American end user. This policy chaos is not happening in a vacuum, but is landing directly on an American agricultural sector that is already in deep distress. To understand the severity of this self-inflicted wound, we need to look at the data coming out of the American heartland. In 2024, farm bankruptcies in the United States increased by 55% over the previous year. A total of 216 family farms filed for bankruptcy protection. These are not just statistics. These are generational businesses. Take, for example, Todd Western III, a soybean farmer in Waterloo, Iowa. His farm was established in 1864 by ancestors who traveled their way out of slavery to settle the land. He describes farming as a labor of love, done for the legacy of the family. But love doesn't pay the bills when the economics of farming are broken. Farmers like Todd Western are facing a perfect storm. They worry about drought, pricing, equipment, and financing. And now, tariffs are just another burden on the pile. The cost of doing business has skyrocketed. Everything they use to run their business, from the seeds they plant to the machinery they drive, has increased in price. The situation with farm machinery provides a stark example of how tariffs backfire. The U.S. government has imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, ostensibly to protect American metal producers. But for companies that make farm equipment, like John Deere, this means their raw material costs have exploded. John Deere reported that these higher tariffs on steel and aluminum would cost the company $600 million in 2025 alone. This has led to absurd outcomes in the manufacturing sector. Consider the case of the combine manufacturer class. This company made the decision to shut down its manufacturing operations in the United States and move them to Germany. Why? Because the cost of manufacturing in the U.S. was getting too high due to tariffs on imported steel and parts. By moving to Germany, they could source global materials without the tariff penalty, manufacture the combines, and then export them. And who are their main customers for these German-built machines? Canadian farmers. So we have a situation where Canadian farmers are buying high-quality machinery more cheaply because it is being produced in a tariff-free environment in Europe. Meanwhile, American farmers cannot escape the higher costs. If they import the machine, they pay a tariff. If they buy a U.S.-made machine, they pay the inflated production costs passed on by the manufacturer. The U.S. administration has tried to address these rising machinery costs with a different kind of solution. The president has claimed that the reason machinery is so expensive is not tariffs, but environmental excesses. In a rambling statement, he suggested that modern tractors are too complicated and that you need about 185 IQ to turn on a lawnmower. His plan is to remove environmental restrictions, claiming this will bring prices down. But this ignores the economic reality that the core cost drivers are the tariffs on the materials themselves. While the United States is busy destabilizing its own food supply and alienating its neighbors, its primary global competitor is executing a masterclass in adaptation. To understand the long-term danger for the U.S. and the opportunity for Canada, we must look at what is happening with China. The headline is staggering. China has just shrugged off U.S. tariffs to record a world record trade surplus of over $1 trillion. This is the first time in modern economic history that any nation has crossed the $1 trillion mark. We have been told for years that the U.S. trade war would crush China, and indeed, Chinese exports to the United States have fallen. In November, they were down nearly 29% year on year. If you only looked at that number, you might think the U.S. strategy was working. But you have to look at the global picture. Over the same period, China's total exports actually grew by over 5%. How is that possible? The answer is diversification. China has effectively decoupled its growth from the American consumer. In 2018, China's dependence on the U.S. market was around 20%. Today, it has dropped to between 10% and 12%. China has untethered itself. Instead of fighting a losing battle for the U.S. market, China has pivoted to the rest of the world. Consider the numbers. Chinese exports to Africa reached $60 billion by September 2025. Exports to Southeast Asia rose by 14%, while exports to Latin America grew by over 7%. Even exports to the European Union increased by 15%. China is not waiting for the U.S. to become a reliable partner again. They are building a new trading order that simply bypasses North America. This is what economists are calling the second China shock. The first shock was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when China flooded the world with cheap, labor-intensive goods: toys, wigs, footwear, and holiday decorations. That era decimated manufacturing jobs in the West. But this second shock is different. China has moved up the value chain. They are no longer just making cheap plastic goods. They are now the dominant global supplier of solar panels, electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and shipbuilding tonnage. They have expanded into robotics and medical devices. The United States has tried to view this through the lens of history, comparing it to the rise of Germany or Japan. But those comparisons fail. Germany's surplus was never viewed as a systemic threat to U.S. leadership in technology or defense. Germany, as a NATO ally, has been militarily and psychologically dependent on the U.S. since 1945. The comparison with Japan in the 1980s is even more instructive. Back then, Japan had a massive trade surplus with the U.S., concentrated in autos and electronics. The U.S. viewed this as an economic Pearl Harbor. Washington applied massive pressure, forcing Japan to sign the Plaza Accord in 1985. Which revalued the yen and crushed the Japanese export economy, leading to their lost decade. Why did it work against Japan, but is failing against China? Because Japan was dependent. Over 30% of Japan's exports went to the U.S. They had no military autonomy. They were deeply integrated into the U.S. financial system. They had no plan B. China, by contrast, has a plan B. They have the scale, the military strength, and the diversified global market access to resist U.S. pressure. They are not capitulating, they are accelerating. While the U.S. argues about tariffs on potash and tries to restart old industries, China is locking down the industries of the future. However, the damage the U.S. is inflicting on itself goes beyond just this year's GDP figures. It is destroying the intangible infrastructure of the global economy: trust. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman points out, the United States spent 90 years building a rules-based global trading system. From the days of FDR through the creation of the GATT and the WTO, the U.S. was the architect of a system based on agreements and laws. Now the U.S. is actively ripping up that system. The tariffs on Canadian goods are a violation of international agreements. The United States will never be trusted again in the same way. Even if a new administration comes in and reverses these policies, the memory will remain. Countries now know that the U.S. can and will violate its word on a whim. Krugman notes that tariffs are, in effect, a national sales tax. They are a consumption tax levied on the domestic population. By imposing them, the U.S. is making itself poorer and less efficient. He estimates that even the current tariffs will reduce U.S. GDP by 0.5 percentage point in the long run. But the chaos is the real killer. Businesses hate uncertainty. A factory that looks profitable today might be bankrupt tomorrow if the tariff rate changes from 10% to 25% based on a television interview. This unpredictability wreaks havoc with investment. It forces companies to hoard cash instead of spending it. It freezes supply chains. The North American auto industry is a prime example. It is not really a U.S. industry or a Canadian industry. It is a North American industry. Parts of a single car may cross the border 7 or 8 times during production. Every time they cross, they face the threat of new tariffs and delays. This destroys the efficiency that made the industry competitive in the first place. So, where does this leave Canada? And specifically, where does this leave Saskatchewan? The message from the data is clear. The United States is currently an unreliable partner. It is a one-man destruction ball inflicting wounds on its own economy and its allies. But Canada holds a powerful hand. We have what they need. The structural power in this relationship lies with the producer of the essential resource. The U.S. needs Canadian potash. They cannot grow their food without it. They cannot innovate their way out of a geological deficit. However, having leverage is only useful if you are not dependent. If Canada continues to send 50% of its potash to the United States, we remain vulnerable to their political volatility. The U.S. can still inflict pain, even if it hurts them more. The lesson from China is the only viable path forward for Canada. Diversify, diversify, diversify. Canadian corporations and the government must stop waiting for the United States to return to normal. We must aggressively develop markets in Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. We must build the infrastructure, the ports, the rail lines, to get our resources to these global customers. If China can pivot its massive export machine in the face of 37% tariffs, surely Saskatchewan can diversify its customer base for a product that the world is desperate for. We must untether ourselves from the train wreck of U.S. protectionism. The U.S. economy is robust, yes. It is too big to be destroyed by one buffoon, as one commentator noted. But it is currently in a period of self-destruction that we do not need to be part of. Friends, the very severe tariffs threatened against Saskatchewan are not just a trade dispute. They are a symptom of a superpower that has lost its way, a nation that has forgotten the basic laws of economics and geology. They are trying to bully a supply chain they do not control. They are taxing their own farmers in a misguided attempt to change the Earth's geology. But for Canada, this is a clarifying moment. It is a signal that we must stand on our own 2 feet. We must recognize the immense value of the resources we hold, from the potash in Saskatchewan to the energy in Alberta. We must use this structural power not to fight a trade war, but to build a diversified, resilient economy that answers to no single foreign capital. The United States may choose to isolate itself. It may choose to make its food more expensive and its farmers poorer. But Canada does not have to follow them down that path. We have the resources, we have the opportunity. Now, we just need the will to look beyond the border and embrace the world. As we conclude today, I want to leave you with one final challenging thought, a big picture reality that goes beyond the price of fertilizer or the whims of a president. Throughout this analysis, we have discussed the need to diversify. We have pointed to China's success in pivoting to Africa and South America as a model for Canada. But there is a hard truth we must face, a truth that makes this pivot far more difficult for us than it was for China. For the last 80 years, Canada has operated under an unwritten contract known as the special relationship. We believed that if we supplied the United States with secure energy, reliable resources, and loyal defense cooperation, we would be granted a privileged exemption from American protectionism. We believed our geography was our destiny, and that our prosperity was inextricably linked to the health of the American empire. Because of this belief, we built our nation to serve that relationship. Look at a map of our infrastructure. Our oil pipelines flow south. Our electrical grids connect south. Our rail networks are integrated south. We physically wired our economy to be an annex of the United States. We built a funnel, not a network. The events of the last few months, the threats against Saskatchewan, the tariffs on steel, the erratic policymaking, have not just violated trade agreements, they have shredded that unwritten contract. The special relationship is dead. It has been replaced by a transactional realism where friendship grants no immunity. I would love to hear your perspective on this fundamental shift. Is Canada ready to accept that the old rules no longer apply? Or are we still clinging to a partnership that has already moved on? Let's discuss this in the comments below. This leaves us with a profound structural deficit. We cannot simply decide to sell our potash to India or our energy to Japan tomorrow if we lack the physical means to get it there. Diversification is just a buzzword without the concrete and steel to back it up. This is the great strategic imperative of our time. It is not enough to simply sign new trade deals. We require a new era of national nation building. We need to resurrect the spirit that built the Canadian Pacific Railway, a determination to conquer our own geography to reach the world. This means expanding our ports on the west coast and the east coast to handle massive increases in tonnage. It means building the pipelines and rail capacity to move our resources east and west rather than just south. It means creating a northern corridor that allows us to bypass American logistics entirely. We must understand that infrastructure is sovereignty. If we cannot move our own goods to the global market without passing through American territory or relying on American permission, we are not a sovereign trading nation, we are a captive one. The very severe tariffs threatened against us are a painful wake-up call, but they may be the greatest gift we could have received. They have shattered the illusion of comfort. They have forced us to realize that the easy road south is now a toll road, and the price is our economic independence. Canada is a G7 nation. We are a resource superpower. We have the food, the fuel, and the fertilizer the world is desperate for. But to leverage that power, we must stop acting like a tenant in our own continent and start acting like a landlord. We must build the infrastructure of independence. The era of the special relationship is over. The era of the global Canadian has just begun. The only question remaining is whether we have the political will to build it. Thank you for watching. If you value this kind of independent, data-driven analysis, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to dig past the headlines.